All right, in today's video, it's Contract Basics Part 2. I had already done a video, first video on the basics of contracts. Here's a link in your upper right-hand corner of your screen. I highly recommend you watch that one, then come back to this one, because this video series, one video builds upon another. So go watch that one, then come back here. All right, today we're going to talk about the validity of a contract, and there are 4 areas I want to discuss. These 4 here. Then we're going to run into the situational or scenarios that can impact the validity of our contract. All right, so let's start with the first bucket here, or first concept, and that is a valid contract. Now, a valid contract is, it complies with all the requirements of the contract. It is completely enforceable in a court of law, and all the parties they're basically holding true and performing as required under the contract. Now, the next one is a void contract. What happens when a contract is void? Well, it's interesting because it has all the essential elements of a valid contract. It appears to be valid, but there's something that creates a scenario where it's void. Give you a couple of examples where this might happen. Number 1, if the contract is for an illegal purpose. All right, so I'll give you an example. I remember many years ago listening to the radio when I was on my way to work, and a story was out of Texas where a husband had contracted a person to actually kill his wife. The agreement was $5,000 up front, $5,000 when the job was done, and they actually put it into writing. That's why they called it a stupid criminal story. The point is, it had all the essential elements of a valid contract, but it was for an illegal purpose. Therefore, it's a void contract. Another thing, in many states, if someone has been declared legally insane or legally incompetent for whatever reason, maybe they have dementia or something like that, then even though all the contract terms are there and all the essential elements, it's actually a void contract. All right? The next example is a voidable contract. A voidable contract, and when we see a voidable contract, typically it is binding completely on one party, but the other party can void the contract. Give you an example, very common. A minor that enters into a lease agreement with the landlord. The landlord is totally and completely bound by the terms of that contract, and in fact, the minor can enforce those terms if he or she wanted to. However, the minor, it's avoidable. They can void the contract at any time up to the point that the minor becomes the age of majority. That's why we typically don't see people contracting with minors, because the contract is voidable by the minor up to the point that they become the age of majority. And the last one is unenforceable contract or unenforceability. Interestingly enough, it's a valid contract in the terms of having all the essential elements, but it is completely unenforceable. Let me give you an example. Let's say that a buyer and seller are at a restaurant. Buyer says, I offer you $100,000 for your house, and the seller says, great, let's do this. Even if money was exchanged, it's an unenforceable contract because the statute of frauds requires that any real estate contract that has to do with transfer of title or maybe a deed, for example, has to be in writing to be enforceable. So under the operational law, it requires it to be in writing. So even though all the essential elements are there, that would be considered an unenforceable contract. Okay, now the next thing I want to talk about is the 4 scenarios that impact the validity of our contract here. Now, here's where I have to give a little disclaimer. Please, no what ifs. We could what if this to death, and each scenario can have an exception. I'm only teaching the rule here because I'm teaching you what you need to know to pass your licensing exam. Rarely does the licensing exam get into things like exceptions to this. And I know there's going to be an exception or many exceptions to everything we're talking about here, but you don't need to know it for the real estate exam. I'm only giving you the rule here. All right? So the first one I want to talk about is misrepresentation. 2 things you have to know about misrepresentation. The first one, it was done unintentionally. Number 2 is it creates an unenforceable contract. Unintentional and unenforceable. Now, scenario. Now let me give you a scenario here. Let's say that the seller truly thought that the house that they were selling was under public sewer system and it was actually a septic system. And then the buyer relied on that information to purchase the home. The buyer discovers later that it actually is septic and not public. Well, that creates an unenforceable contract. So if the buyer terminated the contract, it would be very difficult for the seller to go into court and try to, enforce the terms of the contract under specific performance or any other remedy that's out there, because it's declared unenforceable. Remember, unintentional equals unenforceability. The next one is what I want to talk about is fraud. Now, using the same scenario, let's say that the seller absolutely knew that it was septic but lied and told the buyer that it was actually under public when it was, they knew that wasn't it. That's fraud. That's an intent to cheat somebody. The difference is the contract under misrepresentation is unenforceable, but under a fraud scenario, the contract is what we call voidable. Now again, I know you probably have all kinds of questions. What if this? What if that? We're not going into the what ifs. We're not going to talk about the standards of proof here, which is all relevant if it goes to court. I'm just giving you what you need to know for the real estate licensing exam. The next one is duress. Let's say that somebody coerces somebody or under the threat of violence. Hey, sign this contract or I'll beat you up, all right? Coercion or threats. That's where we see duress. So somebody signs a contract. Well, how does that impact the validity of a contract? Well, it creates a voidable contract. Voidable. Now understand when a contract is voidable. It's voidable by the party that was under duress. It's voidable by the party that was the victim of the fraud. It's voidable by one party but not the other. And the last one is undue influence. It's a lesser of duress. Typically where we see this in real estate is where it's maybe a child or let's say an elderly seller who's getting up there in age and they're not as sharp as they used to be is being influenced by someone younger than them. So they make a decision based on the recommendation or the influence of that younger person. That's called undue influence. And again, the contract is voidable by the party that was under the undue influence.